Hello and welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested, and today we're going to be taking a look at the BLOODBORNE Trick weapons. Yes, are they practical? Are they useful? Are they designed well or bad? Well, that's what we're going to be getting into. Now the first thing I should mention is it's been quite a long time since we've actually done a BLOODBORNE episode. If you're a long-time viewer of the channel, you'll know that we did the saw spear saw, can't remember which way around it goes, about 2 years ago at this point. Now, I enjoyed that episode, but the reason why I actually haven't done any more since is essentially just like economical more than anything else. It was a long project to do, and then at the same time you're at the mercy of the algorithm, which could completely bomb and tank, so I just haven't felt confident in doing any more. So I thought, why don't I just kind of discuss some of the weapons? We've already done one, which obviously gives me kind of, the practical hands-on experience with it, but at the same time, it means that we can kind of apply that to the other ones, I would say. Now, obviously, we're not going to be going through every single one in today's episode. I mean, if you guys enjoy this one, maybe we'll do another one, who knows? But we're just going to kind of start off with some of the bigger ones and the ones that I think have some more interesting things about them. So let's start off with, I would say, the most popular one, right? That is the saw cleaver. Now, I think we should make this clear before we kind of get into, the analysis part. I'm giving these all more the benefit of the doubt. If they're designed to be functional, they're not too thick or heavy, they're balanced correctly, they have good mechanisms, blah, 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 blah. And the reason why this is important is because if we just took them one-to-one from the games, they're like an inch thick. Like, they're too heavy to be practically and realistically used. So we're kind of giving it a little bit of leeway where it's like, yeah, it's the right thickness and the right, edged profiles and blah, 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 things like that. We're being generous in saying that, they are translated to be functional in the real world. Starting off, this one has, all right, in the closed position, I do like the fact that most of the trick weapons essentially have really, really robust hand protection, almost completely enclosed. Not like a full swept hilt or something like that, but like a knuckle bow, right? They essentially offer good hand protection. I like that. They obviously then have those aggressive serrations on one side. Now, in the closed position, these are, facing out. Serrations are complicated because it depends how aggressive they are, I would say, because like usually if you check out serrations on something like a knife, right, they're actually very, I would say, thin. They're not very high in terms of the teeth, which means that they do still cut kind of like a regular blade, whereas obviously in these particular weapons, they are more like saw teeth. So these serrations are far more aggressive. Now, these ones are a bit of a problem because obviously if the teeth are facing one way, you can still slice with them like you would a regular blade. It's the moment you actually go the opposite way, they really get stuck, especially on things like cloth and gambeson and softer types of fabric and material. Those serrated teeth get stuck and caught. I hate this. However, on flesh, they obviously are very aggressive, right? That's essentially what these serrations do. Then the blade does have kind of a little bit of a hook, which I think is really cool because obviously a hook on a blade like this is useful. Then we have that large cleaving surface. It's a saw cleaver after all, which essentially I would say has reasonable edge geometry. It looks like it would be an absolute monster in the chop, which obviously that's what it's made to do, right? Saw cleaver. The only issue that I have with it in the open position is, well, there's two of them really. First off is there's no hand protection when it's opened up. Your hands are completely exposed. Second of all, it has no thrusting capability at all. And the reason why this is a detriment is because obviously like something with the saw spear, whichever way around it is, this is very similar in its design. We'll get to this one in a minute, but essentially having a thrusting point would take nothing away from the design. It would literally just only add versatility. So that is a downside, the fact that you can't thrust with this blade. So overall, I would say in the closed position, I don't really find that useful, personally speaking, and that kind of goes for all of these weapons that have these pivots. I mean, I should save this to the end, but I'll mention it now because it's important. Them having this articulation pivot point, the opening, the closing mechanism, is just a weak point in the blade. And we actually already have kind of, I would say, the data on this. You know, if somebody's going out camping for the weekend, or if somebody needs a blade for agricultural purposes, for combat purposes, whatever it is really, usually they have a fixed blade, meaning a solid blade tank construction that doesn't really move or have any mechanical components. There's a reason why if I'm going out camping, or I'm going out to, you know, do some work or something like that, I'm not really going to be carrying a folding blade just because they are inherently weaker. It doesn't really have a tang. It means that you're at the mercy of that pivot point and the locking mechanism. And if either of one of those fail, which is 2 failure points, your entire weapon fails. So obviously that is just not good with the trick weapons in general. If you're enjoying today's episode, you should really consider subscribing. I mean, I have a saw shield. I mean, I have a twin blade here. But if a twin blade isn't enough, I also have a trident. This is the type of content I do, along with giant swords and a whole host of other stuff. So if you like these sorts of things, you should consider subscribing. Overall, the saw cleaver isn't necessarily actually one of my favorite ones, which leads us to the next one. We'll actually talk about it now, which is the spear saw, the saw spear, which is one of my favorite ones. Reason being, it's very similar to the saw cleaver. In the closed position, it has the serrations on the outside. It has, you know, that knuckle protection, which is good. Essentially, you still have no reach, which is not ideal. In the open position, we have, I would say, on the last, you know, third of the blade, a cutting surface, so you can cut and slice with it, essentially like a regular, you know, sword, right? But at the same time, it has a thrusting point. This is what makes the difference, because this means that you can keep opponents at reach, at measure, and you can thrust. And thrusts are more deadly than chops. So overall, I like the saw spear more than the saw cleaver. I think it's just way more practical. Next up, let's take a look at one that I'm really not the biggest fan of, that being the threaded cane. So as a cane, like a walking canes are an interesting weapon. We've tested a couple of them on the channel actually. I like them, but they're not really, how do I describe this? I wouldn't bring a cane to a sword fight. I wouldn't bring a cane to a gunfight. But they're still really cool, right? However, obviously the trick aspect of the threaded cane is it essentially turns into, I would call it a whip sword personally, but again, like it has like these large, I would say, saw teeth more than a blade. But I would technically call this an articulated whip sword, right? The first problem with this is, the first one I would say that is an objective flaw no matter what is, when you have an articulated weapon, you usually want it to be a certain length so that it's actually not going to hit your hand, so you can't actually have ricochet. Like that's kind of like the golden rule of threaded weapons. You don't want it to be, you don't want the articulation to be long enough to actually hit yourself. With these sort of, you know, articulated swords, usually because they're long sword blades, they break that rule. And, you know, we've tested a threaded sword before. Kind of similar to the threaded cane, like very different blade shapes and geometries, but similar in, I would say, its kind of execution. And it's a terrible weapon for multiple reasons, honestly. Oh! Ouch. That was right on the elbow. The first issue with these sort of articulated, you know, whip, blade, sword type things is they don't have any follow through power, meaning when I have obviously a static blade, I can put in more power once I've actually made contact with the target. When you swing one of these blades, once that kinetic energy has been lost, they're essentially, they're a floppy piece of steel, right? You can't actually put more structure into your strikes. Secondly, because of how they are articulated, it means that there's a lot of movements that you can't really perform because you need to keep the momentum going. Meaning when I have a blade, if I want to, you know, change the direction of my strike very suddenly, I can do that. With an articulated weapon, you can't really do that because there's no structure in the rest of the blade. You kind of need to obviously keep that momentum going to be able to change, you know, essentially change the direction of your strike. Not ideal. And then the next downside is obviously because it doesn't really have a continuous cutting surface. It's essentially like the actual chain on a chainsaw that has the saw teeth on it. as in when you try and cut or slice something, there's a whole bunch of little serrations that are just going to get stuck, especially in soft things. And the thing is, the moment you're actually wearing any sort of armor or protective gear, these sorts of articulated weapons usually, especially the sword types, usually lose basically all of their, I would say, lethality about them. Now obviously it's a little bit different with something that has, you know, more of a force concentrating mass behind it, but with these sorts of, you know, whip sword type things, the moment that you're going against an armored opponent, they really kind of become almost useless. And obviously it has no hand protection at all. The funny thing is, this is just a far more useful weapon as just the cane. This one is not a good weapon. Like, obviously we're talking about in the real world, right? Functionality. Not like in the game, if you enjoy it, that's fine. I'm just talking about real world applications here. Next up, this one is actually one of my favorites, and that is the Beast Hunter Scythe. Reason being, obviously similar to the other, you know, trick weapons, in its closed position you have a really nice curved blade, no serrations on it, which means, you know, it's gonna slice and cut pretty nicely. You have that good hand protection like I mentioned, but you still have the downside of zero reach, which is, you know, not ideal. But in the open position it essentially becomes a very curved sword. I mean, maybe you could call this one a glaive because it's kind of 50-50, you know. Actually, yeah, I might actually call this one a glaive. Either way, it essentially becomes a sword type weapon that has two different types of cutting modes, I would say. One with a very aggressive curve on it, kind of like a shamshir, or if you know, change your indexing on the blade, turn it around to the other side, you have something akin to something like maybe a falx, where you have that forward-facing cutting surface, which allows you to put a lot of force into it, which is really good. So you have two different modes, I would say, with this particular blade shape and geometry. I like that. No hand protection in the open position, really not ideal, but you could also, it wouldn't be the best at it, but you could thrust with it. So that is also a positive. So I like this one. I think I like this one the most. I think I like this one more than the saw spear and the saw cleaver. Yeah, I think this one is the best so far. And the threaded cane is the worst. Threaded cane is at the bottom. Then we come to what I might consider to be actually maybe even better than the Beast Hunter Scythe. But there's context here. So this one here is the Hunter Burial Blade. Now this one is essentially two weapons that you put together, and that's why I like it. So let's talk about it in its completed form, which is essentially just a agricultural scythe. Agricultural scythes are not really the most functional weapons. Having that blade at a 90 degree is not really the most practical because obviously you have no thrusting capability. You're not actually making the best use of your reach, especially for a large weapon with a large haft. And at the same time, all of the cutting potential of an agricultural scythe is actually on the inside of the blade because it's supposed to cut grass, which means as a weapon, they're not really that good. When it is in two separate pieces, you essentially have a regular sword and a large staff, or you know, you have the haft as one piece that folds out, which is a big stick essentially. I like that. And then you also have, as the other half, a really curved blade that is able to thrust and cut and be spun around and used kind of like with a forward-facing curve, like we mentioned before, like with the Beast Hunter Scythe. So I actually really kind of dig this one. I think it's pretty cool. The biggest issue is, obviously, it doesn't have any hand protection in any of its configurations. Isn't that funny? A lot of the Bloodborne weapons don't have any hand protection. Now, I know that they're obviously hunting the beasts and stuff like that, but it's, again, still, you know, hand protection could have saved me from the Orphan of Kos, okay? Could have. Anyway, out of all of the weapons, I do like this one, just because you kind of get two weapons for the price of one. And you could probably modify it very easily to turn it into an actual war scythe. You know, obviously change the orientation of the blade. Anyway, we're not talking about that. That's not canon. This one, I would say, is reasonable because obviously it's a lot bigger than all the others. You've got a lot more reach with it. Even as an agricultural scythe, because it's so physically large, you do have a lot of reach, which is good. And the blade itself, by itself, is pretty good. Just needs, you know, hand protection. But I would actually say the most practical out of all of these ones, all right, we're not going to do all of them, like I said, but out of all of these ones that I've taken a look at, I think the Beast Hunter Scythe is, like, that's the one I would pick. That's the one where I would be like, yeah, I would actually use this one. The other ones I'd be like, nah. And if you're wondering which one I think is not the most practical, it's the threaded cane. Everything else is better than the threaded cane. But to sum up my thoughts on a lot of the trick weapons, right? In their closed position, you essentially have no reach, and I really just wouldn't use that mode very often. And the problem I have is obviously in the closed position or the open position, the trade-off that you're making for a full tank construction is that pivot. It is that locking mechanism, which are 2 additional points of failure in your weapon, all for essentially the weapon just to open and close, which I just wouldn't really ever choose. I'd much prefer just a static weapon, you know, like a full tank construction. It's just stronger, more practical, and more reasonable, right? But apart from that, in their open position, they're fascinating designs that obviously do have lethality about them. I would just like a little bit more defensive kind of abilities of the trick weapons. Now, obviously, I know you have a gun for parrying, so I guess that's your defense. What's the best hand protection? Gun. It's like, well, hard to argue with that, I guess. Anyway, that is going to be all. I hope you enjoyed. This was just a fun episode. Kind of just wanted to rant a little bit about some of the trick weapons. And if you guys like this episode, maybe we'll do some of the other ones. But that is going to be all for now. Thank you guys for watching. And as always, I'll see you next week in another episode. Have a good one.